Heresy Alpha, Book 1 of the Marian Imperium by Richard Warren. Chapter 10. Alistair. The ships came into port, their black sails fluttering in the hot morning breeze. He leant out the palace window, trying to get a better look. Something was wrong. There was something else on board, something the Alexandrian sailors hadn't meant to bring with them. Planks rattled as men rolled casks off the ships and carried amphorae onto the quayside. A large shadow leapt from one of the wine jars and dashed across the cobbles like a bolt of black lightning. "No," he said, but the sailors couldn't hear him. Instead, they continued to unload more casks and amphorae. More shadows leapt out of the barrels and jars and scuttled off into the city in all directions. He cried out in despair, but it was no use. More ships piled into the port. Soon their great black sails filled the harbour. He waved his hands frantically, but none of the sailors could see him up in the palace. Across the strait, the entire channel was filling up with the awful sails. They swelled with a sultry wind from the south, and there was a stench on that wind, a sweet, foul stench. It was the stench of death. Down on the quayside, one of the sailors collapsed right before the palace gate. His fellows looked about nervously, but, seeing the harsh morning sun, only shook their heads. Behind them, unnoticed by anyone, shadows darted off the ships in ever greater numbers. Soon they poured onto the cobblestones like a tide of black gore, seeping under doors, into houses, churches and temples. He screamed at the sailors, but still they did not hear him. Another man fell, then another. Men fell overboard as they tried to alight from the ships, or else were struck dead before their ships even came to port. Black blotches sprouted like mushrooms all over their olive skin, as their eyes became like cloudy glass. Corpses clawed at the living. The barrels floated back out to sea. The amphorae smashed and the wine ran into the dry stones, staining them the colour of blood. The foul meridional wind blew hotter on his face as the morning sun turned the channel crimson. He gripped the mosaic tiles of the windowsill. The wall of black sails was so thick that he could no longer see his drome and galleons. How could the western provinces be retaken now? The barbarians would surely recapture the old city, so hard won by Belisar. Was this the punishment of the Almighty? He looked down at his arms. The wool of his imperial toga melted away like a wax candle. Soon he was entirely naked. Sores burgeoned on his pallid skin, spreading over his body like black ink on blotting paper. Rats ran up his arms and down his back. He tried to catch at them, but they kept getting away. A vermilion haze rose from the Bosphorus, bleeding into the blackened stones of the quayside. His vision blurred. He looked up at the sun, pleading mercy for his hubris. "If this is thy will, then strike me down, but spare me this torment," he tried to cry out, but his voice choked in his throat. His tears came in a flood. Alistair tasted salt on his damp pillow and awoke with a start. One of the rats was gnawing at his shoulder. He knocked it away and slowly opened his bleary eyes. The charcoal sails and blood-red sky evaporated. The blotches on his arms were gone. It was dark. Someone was gripping his shoulder, shaking him. That was odd. He didn't share his cabin. He bolted upright, shoving the disembodied arm away. A shadow stumbled backwards in the darkness. "Master Alistair," a voice whispered. "It is I, Brother Lucas. Please do not be alarmed." The young friar, who had handed him his present the evening before, staggered back to Alistair's bedside. "But what is the meaning of—" Alistair said, but the friar raised a finger to his lips. Most of the monks were normally quite content to listen to him prattling on without saying a word themselves. Indeed, he was usually quite frustrated that they said so little. He wasn't sure he could recall ever being asked to shut up, not least by someone who had entered his cell uninvited. He opened his mouth, but something in the poor friar's eyes gave him pause. It was written all over his face, unmistakable even in the shadows. Fear. The man was afraid, but of what? He looked out the window, still half expecting to see black sails. It wasn't even first light yet, and the basilica couldn't be seen. "Please, Master Alistair," Lucas said, "I bear a message from Father Zosim, who, as you know, cares dearly for you." The monk wasn't carrying a candle, nor had he lit one when he arrived, but his eyes shone strangely. "The venerable father says that you are to leave, and that you must leave now," the friar whispered. "Don't even wait for first light, nor are you to look for him." Alistair's brows knitted. "Why?" he asked, but again Lucas raised his finger to his lips. The monk squeezed his shoulder. He was trembling all over, and his hand was clammy with sweat. Alistair made to reply, but Lucas was already at the door. "Go now, young master. Do not delay. I implore you," he said on the threshold. "Your life may depend upon it." He nodded at the satchel that Alistair had left beside the door the night before. His wide eyes beheld him one last time, then, without another word, he disappeared into the night. Alistair sat motionless on his bed. His mind ran in rapid circles around the cabin, but his limbs felt as leaden as the apostolica roof. Lucas's horrid eyes still stared back at him from the shadows. There were muffled voices from somewhere without. Father Zosim's face appeared, disembodied and floating in the half-light of the dawn. "Do not sleep too heavily this night," his words thundered through the silence. "Violentia." He leapt from the bed and grabbed his satchel. Throwing an old surcoat over his shoulders, he shoved his feet into his boots and hurtled to the door. Hardly knowing what he was doing, he leaned out into the dewy Latian morning, brushing the cobwebs from his eyes. He looked up the path, but immediately yanked his head back inside. At its summit were a cluster of Marians. There couldn't have been fewer than 20 of them, easily twice the number he had ever seen in the reservation. "Go now, master. Your life may depend upon it," Lucas called from the darkness. His heart pounded as he leant against the doorframe. Another voice was screaming deafeningly inside his own head. "Go now! Go now!" He bounded out the door and down the path, rushing headlong like a wild boar. His pack clattered on his back, but he didn't look back. He had to get away, away from the dormitory, away from the basilica, away from the reservation. Away from the reservation? The question nearly tripped him as he ran. He bowled around the corner of the last dacha. Up ahead, the track that ran around the back of the dormitory was all clear. He leant against the back of the hut, gasping for breath. His back was damp with sweat, and he could already feel a stitch coming on. He peered back up the path. The Marians were fanning out among the dachas at the far end. They had magic torches in their hands, and their white berets glinted in the light they gave off. White, not the usual black. That was odd. "Go now," the inner voice screamed again, and he hurtled on down the track. Beyond the last row of shacks was a walled orchard in the midst of the allotment where the friars grew their vegetables. He made for the door in the stone wall. Raising its iron latch as quietly as he could, he pulled it ajar and slipped inside. There was no one about, just the silent ranks of the apple trees. The cotton of their blossoms shone in the first light of dawn, the same colour as the Marians' berets. Why were they white today? The morning erupted in a cacophonous din of shouting and wailing as doors crashed open. "Violentia!" He pushed off the wall and ran into the trees. The cries grew louder as he bounded towards the far wall, ducking beneath the apple boughs and tearing through the overgrown grass. Nettles snapped at his calves like serpents, but he hardly noticed the pain. Like the Apostolica, he knew the orchards and allotments well, and even in the semi-darkness soon reached the far wall. He lifted the door bolt and slipped through, but as he did so, another bolt clanked behind. They were after him. Petrified, he ran down the old garden path beyond the orchard. Less a garden now than an overgrown knot of weeds. Its unpaved track was still just about discernible from the dilapidated statues that once marked its way. He threaded through the ancient plinths, endeavouring not to trip over the shards of marble limbs and fragmentary wings that lay all about. Most were angels described in the book, but in the half-light their hollow eye sockets and lopsided jaws leered at him like demons. Others were altogether headless, their torsos casting long shadows like cornstalks in the dawn. He hardly knew where he was going, except away from the dormitory. It was the way westward, the way out to the perimeter, to the Pomerium. Pomerium. The word chilled him to the bones. The old city limit that marked the end of the reservation, the end of the old law. He'd never actually seen it. Still, if what the monks said was true, it was heavily guarded, and not just that. It was said to be threaded through with some kind of invisible fire, like some magical fleece, which, once you were wrapped in, you couldn't get out of, and which burned you to cinders. How had he hoped to get beyond it? What had he been thinking? It had been madness to try and run away. There was a noise behind. He hastily concealed himself beneath the plinth of the last statue. He could just make out the solitary figure of a soldier, framed in relief against the travertine of the orchard wall, like one of the forsaken people on the old patriarch's arch. Ahead, the path dissolved completely, disappearing into a thicket of cypresses. In terror, he launched himself into their midst, praying that he hadn't been seen. Like a bear pursued by an ancient hero, he bounded through the trees, borne along by his own weight. He'd never come this far before and had no idea where he was going, but some instinct told him he was leaving the old palace precinct. The ground sloped downwards as the cypresses grew denser and became intermixed with poplars and pines. The undergrowth thickened too, and his feet kept getting tangled in the weeds. Water trickled somewhere below. Soon there were stagnant pools on all sides. There was more rustling behind. The soldier must have seen him, or guessed he'd come this way. Alistair's brow was damp with sweat, and his feet were wet too. He must have waded into a shallow swamp without noticing. Something moved among the dark poplars ahead, where the bank rose again. There were more of them. He was caught in a ditch, surrounded on both sides. He flailed about in terror, but there was no way out. Hook! Hook! Disembodied crowds resounded around the ditch as the soldiers called each other to the spot. 2 white berets glinted among the poplars. At the same time, a thrashing noise came from behind as someone tore through the undergrowth. He dived into the bushes, crawling on all fours to where the cover was densest. At first, his hands and knees splashed noisily in the muddy water, but soon the pool deepened as the stream coursed along his flanks. The shouting ceased. Footsteps shuffled about somewhere nearby. He kept as still as he could, straining his ears as he tried not to breathe. "Quo fugit?" a gruff voice asked, where he'd disappeared to. Someone said something in reply. The words were too quiet to make out, but the voice was familiar. The gruff one shouted something angrily, then there was thrashing in the bushes close by. Alistair looked about in alarm. Something glistened ahead amidst the wicker canvas of moss and weeds. Flattening his body, he slid across the mud towards it, feeling like a sea triton from the old stories. If only he hadn't been such an oaf, and more like the Marion, the legionnaire would have slipped through the undergrowth like a fish. The plashing grew louder until it drowned out all else, and water soon splashed his face and chest. Between its jets, the shard of light gradually took the form of a rusty grill. Water spewed from its iron lattice, which was slightly ajar. Beyond was a dark tunnel. "What fugit, puer?" the gruff one repeated, addressing the second as a boy. His reply was inaudible, but an angry stamping of feet followed, which made Alistair's blood run cold. If they found him, he was surely done for. He was right up against the grill now. The water rushed out in a torrent, submersing his head and soaking the pack on his back. His hair was full of leaves, and his surcoat completely caked in mud. "Hook! Hook!" a voice said nearby. Gripping the grill, Alistair peered into the darkness. It was now or never. With a last desperate effort, he prized it open and thrust himself inside. The tunnel was narrow, and the cold stones scraped painfully against his back as the water ran up his nostrils. No sooner had he squeezed himself in, there was a loud crash hard by, as leaves and branches fell into the water. He lowered himself into the water, keeping his nose and eyes just above the surface. Raised voices floated into the tunnel. "Hicerat sed fugit, homuncule, nonne?" The harsh voice berated the other for letting Alistair escape. "You legionnaires think you're the gift of Our Lady, but the truth is you're just a bunch of useless idiots. The kid was right under your nose, but you let him get away, didn't you?" Another branch was torn asunder nearby, and 2 white berets came into view between the trees. A black beret appeared opposite. It was the Latin. One of the white berets came up to him. A man of gargantuan proportions, he stood a full head and shoulders over the legionnaire. "It's like I always say," the giant continued, switching to italic as he addressed the other white beret. "If you want something done, don't leave it to a legionnaire. Leave the serious business to the grown-ups. Leave it to the Praetorians. Otherwise you can rest assured this lot will bugger it up." He jabbed at the Latin's chest as the other smiled sardonically. The Praetorian was hideous to behold, with a jutting brow and pockmarked cheeks like the face of the moon, as if some long-forgotten titan buried beneath the Latian soil had broken his chains and resurfaced on earth. Despite the legionnaire's proud mien, his whole figure cowered before the ancient brute. "That's right. If this fancy boy had spent less time preening himself, we'd have caught the fat one by now," the titan said. "In Justinia's name, to think, they call themselves soldiers and they can't even catch a bunch of old men and 1 kid. Come on, let's not waste any more time with this idiot. The kid's obviously gone." As he concluded his harangue, he prodded his index finger into the legionnaire's jerkin so hard that he lost his balance and stumbled backwards into the undergrowth. The Praetorian slapped his comrade on the back as they walked away, laughing raucously as he pointed at the Latin's black beret, which had rolled off his head into the mud. For some time, the legionnaire lay in the bushes without stirring as the laughter receded. At length he sat up, reaching for his beret. He tried unsuccessfully to dust off the black felt, then brushed down his leather hose. As he made to rise, he put his hand down in the wet leaves. He looked down at his dripping fingers, then gradually turned to the grill. Alistair withdrew into the tunnel, but it was too late. Jackboot splashed nearby. His heart pounded underwater, like a clammy frog thumping against his frozen chest. There was no way he could make a break for it now. A twig cracked beside the entrance. The Latin's handsome face appeared, framed by the circular opening, like a tondo from the Apostolica. Alistair froze so stiffly that he might have been one of the piazza statues. The legionnaire peered under the keystone arch, his face obscured by shadow, but clearly still smarting from the Praetorian's insult. His dark eyes roved over the iron lattice and weathered limestone of the tunnel walls, smoothed by centuries of effluence, before lighting on the shadows where Alistair lay. He lay as still as he could, but the frog's jumping became frantic. The Latin drew his head back into the light. His feline eyes narrowed, squinting at him in the darkness. He had seen him. The cat's eyes fixed on its prey, its mouth compressing into a cruel smile. Leather creaked as a black glove fastened around the grill. Alistair was trembling all over. Perhaps he'd better drown himself then and there and be done with it. A fate more merciful than the fires that surely awaited him. The Latin leaned under the arch, making ready to seize him. "Non ne perfecisti, homuncule," a voice said outside, asking whether he wasn't done yet. The soldier froze. There was more cackling. Alistair paled, his blood as cold as the water on his damp cheeks. Their eyes met. For a few moments, the Latin's face was entirely expressionless, as if he were looking through him into the fathomless darkness beyond. The merciless laughter wafted into the tunnel, drowning out the stream. The soldier's lip quivered. His brow furrowed and unfurrowed itself as his eyes widened. Pride, shame, and anger were all written there at once, like ripples blown by opposing winds across a lake. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they disappeared, swept away like flowers before the plough. His lips stretched into a taut smile. but this time something was different. He was smiling with his eyes. "Homuncule," the legionnaire said. Something showed in his eyes that Alistair did not understand, but which reminded him of Brother Lucas's earnest face in the candlelight. Alistair opened his mouth, but the soldier had already vanished. The grille slammed shut. There was a rustling, and a pile of leaves fell across the entrance, completely obscuring it.